Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. Just a short thought for you today from James chapter 1, starting in verse 12. James says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed." Notice starting in verse 12 that James encourages those who endure temptation. This means to overcome temptation. It doesn't mean to go through temptation and fall to it. That's not what James is talking about. Those who endure temptation are those who overcome temptation without sinning. For when he has been approved, that means when he has been tested and has come through that testing and passed the test, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And I think that's really interesting. James says to those who love him, because Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And we won't allow temptation to get in the way of obeying God. And so I think that's a really neat connection there that James makes, that the Lord has promised to those who love him, but only we can claim we love him all we want to, but it's only if we overcome and do his will that proves we love him. And then he goes on to say, not to blame God, excuse me, when we're tempted, because God cannot be tempted by evil, and he does not tempt anyone. That doesn't mean he doesn't allow things to happen or allow temptation to come our way. As we talked about in our last daily devotional, there are times that God allows things. If God wills, we will live and do this and that, as we notice from James chapter 4. But God doesn't, first of all, send temptation, and he doesn't cause evil to take place. That temptation is from Satan. And of course, now Satan, the devil, he's not mentioned here in James chapter 1. I think that's important to note. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Now, the means of being drawn away, the luring of the desires and enticement of our desires, certainly that is prompted by Satan. The temptation that is being presented, that part of us that seeks to do or say or think whatever it is that we know is wrong, certainly that is, there's that component to it in which Satan is tempting. But notice James, he doesn't mention Satan or the devil. The fact is that we can't blame Satan either. Let no one say when he's tempted, I am tempted by God, nor can we, well, Satan made me do it. We can't make that argument either. James puts the onus of responsibility on each one of us when he says each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. When desire has conceived, now it gives birth to sin. Now notice that we all have these physical elements to us. We all have our own desires, and there are times when we can be enticed, but that doesn't mean we've sinned yet. We can still, up to this point, we can still turn around, just like David, when he's on the balcony, he sees Bathsheba. Okay, he has his own desires, and he was enticed. He could have turned right around, kept his thoughts guarded, and gone back to bed. Now, David didn't do that. He pursued that. When desire has conceived, once action takes place, or some actionable thought takes place, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Now, the difference between giving the desire conceiving, bringing about sin, and sin bringing forth death, all sin, unless we receive forgiveness for it, it brings about death. Whether it's one sin or a million sins makes no difference. Sin is sin. One thing to differentiate, though, here is the fact that I have to make sure I'm seeking to do God's will. And when I sin, I don't just get to just say, well, everybody sins, so, that's life, and just kind of move on. And even argue that, well, what's the difference between someone who's a Christian and they sin versus someone who lives in sin? The difference is one is trying to do what's right and the other isn't. I can even deceive myself, even if I'm, claiming and believing myself to be a faithful Christian. If I'm living in sin, if I'm living in a state, if I'm in the midst of doing things that I know are wrong, and yet I'm not fighting it, I'm not seeking to avoid that temptation, I'm living in sin. And it's important that I understand the difference, that when I stumble, when I commit a sin, that I don't give in to it. And there's a big difference between the two. If I'm trying to do better, if I'm trying to do what's right, and I'm fighting it, there are times I may stumble, and I have the avenue of asking God for forgiveness when I sin, but I can't yield. I can't give in, because that's when I've given my heart, my mind over to whatever it is, and it may be multiple things that I'm doing in which I'm not even fighting anymore. And that's a problem. There's a big difference between those things. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. That's some beautiful words by James, describing how, and this still is all about how that God doesn't send forth evil. God doesn't tempt. He does test. Okay, there are multiple examples in the Old Testament of God testing his people. He doesn't tempt them with sin. Do not be deceived, and he allows temptation to come our way. Like with Job, he allowed Satan to tempt Job. But every good gift and perfect gift is from God. And God doesn't change. It's beautiful, almost poetic way of describing God, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. He is a constant. He calls him the Father of lights. It's not like the sun, where it's in the sky for 12 hours a day and then goes down. Or the moon, where there's variations of the moon throughout the month. No, he's constant. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. We were born again, so to speak. He brought us forth by the word of truth. And the fact that we are a kind of first fruits of his creatures is the sense of those who have decided to follow him, those who have decided to obey him, having been born again, having been created anew. We are first fruits of his creatures. We are those that are who have given ourselves to seeking to follow him. And so I wanted to bring that up, especially in the heels of James chapter 4 we talked about with regard to if the Lord wills, we will live and do this and that, because I think it's certainly connected, and it's important for us to remember that God never overloads us. He never burdens us with anything beyond which we're able to bear. And this is where 1 Corinthians 10, I think, is very important as well. That when Paul says in verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 10, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Now, God does not create the temptation. He allows it to come. But when he allows it, he will also make a way of escape. Now, that form of escape can take many forms, the means of escape. Whether it's talking to a brother or a sister in Christ, opening up God's will, going to God in prayer, whatever it is, there's multiple means and avenues by which we will be able to bear temptation. And certainly this applies to trials of life as well, because trials of life certainly present temptations. But we're not facing anything that faithful people have always faced. I mean, even though the laws are different, nothing we face today is different than what Noah faced in his day, or Moses, or David, or anyone else. But God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able. And it's important that we kind of link and kind of connect these two together, recognizing that back in James, every good thing comes from God. We are not tempted by God. We're tempted by our own desires. But God certainly is in our corner. He's providing us the means to overcome it. And that's what he wants from us. All right. That's our daily devotional today. Lord willing, we'll have our next daily devotional tomorrow at 6:30. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.